With the release of Age of Imprisonment, I wanted to take a look back at the infamous interview answer where Fujibayashi talked about the possibility of destruction before the founding of Raru's kingdom. The reason that I want to talk about this is based around a few things. One of those things is that I actually commissioned a top firm in Japan, that is TMJ Japan, to translate that interview question and answer. And we're going to get into why in all of it. And then I want to kind of cross-reference it with a recent interview at Age of Imprisonment too, and talk about what I think some of that stuff means now in retrospect. To really get into this, I want to talk about my motivation for coming back to this beyond just curiosity, and I want to, because I do like to come back to data over time and reanalyze old things, kind of see like have my thoughts changed about it, things like that. But the second one too is I set out to commission or to get a native speaker translation for this interview question and answer. And the reason why is this topic has become really, really controversial in the Zelda community, with almost everybody who has ever put this up in a video is accused of mistranslating it and trying to mislead the fandom about it or misinterpreting it. So one of the reasons that I did that too is basically to get a bias-free translation of this. And one of the things that you get with that is an explanation of the nuance in the meaning of the words and the phrases from an actual native speaker. So I think I've kind of laid the groundwork, and we're just going to get into it here. The question itself starts, as is our tradition every time, I'd like to ask about the series timeline. Where does The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom fit in? In The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, you depicted the beginning, and in Breath of the Wild, you depicted the end. But Tears of the Kingdom is both a sequel to Breath of the Wild, and it tells a story about the founding of Hyrule. So I was wondering if it might also count as an origin of sorts. And then we get into the translated answer, which is from Fujibayashi, and it says, there is no doubt that the story takes place after Breath of the Wild. And as a basic principle, we always think about the story in the world of the Legend of Zelda series so that it don't fall apart internally. At the present time, those are the only 2 points I can state. If you take it as a premise that it doesn't fall apart internally, then I think that gives fans room to think. In that case, does not mean that there's also this kind of possibility, end quotes. And then they can explore various ideas. Speaking purely in terms of possibilities, even with a story about the founding of Hyrule, there is also the possibility that there exists a history in which everything was destroyed once before that. We're not making things in a slapdash way. Like, wouldn't it be fun if we just did this over here? So I'd be happy if people could enjoy imagining things, including the parts that are deliberately left unspoken. So this is fairly straightforward, but I want to get into the translator notes and information about the nuance that they left behind, because I find it really, really fascinating. And I think that we're all going to learn as we go through this that even coming into a language like English that has the capability of being very verbose at times, there are a distinct lack of words and nuance in the English language to fully express what some of these things mean. And I think you'll see that as we get into it. So let's go. So where this gets interesting is partway through the question, and it's what in English is talking about, wondering if this is an origin. And the phrase specifically is Shizo Okaki. And what that actually means is progenitor, original ancestor, founding origin is like what is coming out of that text. And that's talking about Skyward Sword. And then likewise, talking about Breath of the Wild, you have something similar, where this is actually talking about it as being like the end. And that would be part of the text that is Saigo kaite in Machitaga. And as the interviewer kind of gets to the end of the question, just to frame some of the differences here. Whereas with Skyward Sword is talking about like the depiction of the progenitor of everything else. And the interviewer starts to talk about the rest of it. They say, Hyrule Kenkoku no Hanashi. In English, this comes across as like the story of the founding of Hyrule. But within that text is actually Kenkoku, which is the literal founding of a nation, not just a person becoming a king. It is talking about the original founding of an institutional monarchy. The part that I want to really hone in on next is the preamble and the clause that leads up to his actual answer, where he's talking about them not making things of such a way that they would fall apart. What he actually says there is hatan shinai toyu sente ga areba. And that clause is if there is an assumption that it will not break apart internally. And internally can mean a lot of things, but what this is referring to is that it won't break apart in terms of consistency. And consistency, I think, is probably more important than any other part of that sentence there. They're saying, like, if you assume that this is not going to break apart in an internally consistent way, that's the clause there. And in this next part comes more of that kind of delivery of what he's talking about, where he's referring to people thinking and imagining and speculating, like, what could be, which is the toyo koto wa soreja koi karonse mo. And it is a very long clause for the Japanese language, and it essentially boils down to an English. So is this a possibility when you look at it on its own? And what that's actually, if you put the whole entire thing together, the nuance is really important in this particular answer. Because what he's actually doing, all put together, is encouraging fans to speculate about what's going on within a defined framework. And the defined framework is something that is internally consistent and will not fall apart. And with that out of the way, we're going to get into the parts that I know a lot of people are really, really curious to know more about, which is the explanation about things being potentially destroyed once before. His explanation of this is really, really interesting because of the way that it's wrapped up in the text. So to really, really get into it. In English, this has commonly been seen in all our translations as speaking upon the possibility. It's very literally if we're speaking strictly in terms of possibilities. The word in there that mounts to like the most value, I think, is akumade. And adding that and choosing to add that in to that sentence in his explanation, that opening part of if we're speaking only about possibilities, this is the English equivalent of something that is, if we're talking about purely just hypothetically a for fun statement on paper, this is not talking about something that is actually true. This is like speculative territory, 100%. And then as we move through the answer, next he says, even if there's a story about the founding of Hyrule, that's fairly straightforward. The next part is really interesting though. He says, the literal translation of this would be a history in which something perished. No pronoun is provided in reference to the destroyed history. So they're not actually talking about a destroyed kingdom before the founding of Hyrule at all. Is the equivalent of saying everything was once destroyed before that. Things were destroyed once before. It's not referring to the political entity of Hyrule. There are no words in the sentence that actually give that context to make it about a destroyed kingdom at all. And to take that a step further, next part of the sentence is really interesting too. The scoping of the phrasing is, which is for kishi ka aru kanose. And what is talking about is like there's a possibility that there's a history in which everything perished specifically. So bringing this all together, he's not confirming that there's a pre-destruction history at all. You take the nuance from the previous sentence together with this one, he's trying to create an example of internally consistent speculation that could be entertained. He's not actually saying that any of this happened. He's just saying it could. This is something that fans could speculate about. I think that this is where a lot of translations have kind of gone wrong in places, is that it misses the framing of how these sentences connect together. And that's really important. So it's not a confirmation, but just an example of something fans might speculate about. And then as you get into the next part, there is additional, he's talking about we didn't put this together haphazardly or in a slapdash sort of way. His actual words that he chooses there are phrases like taquito. And what he's saying is like, this wasn't done in a sloppily at all. And I think that's important too. And this is a follow-on to that answer, and it feels like a sort of confirmation of all of the previous context that has been given so far, where he's saying within a framework of consistency, I hope people speculate. An example of that speculation, there could be a case where something that was destroyed before. We're going to get into that in a minute. And then he says, he ends that part with, we didn't do this in a sloppy way. And as it gets to the end of it, the rest of it's fairly straightforward, talking about inviting fans to, he's hoping people imagine the things that are not deliberately spoken about. In some ways, I think like too much emphasis has been placed on this interview question, like this one specifically. Because when you have all the context, it's like he's not actually giving a cryptic answer in the way that it seems when you look at it as an English speaker, so much as he's saying, like, the preamble to this part of the question, name of instruction bits, if you go all the way back to the beginning, is he's saying the only 2 data points that he can give are that it's a sequel to Breath of the Wild, and then it's about the founding of the kingdom. And when the interview presses him further, he doesn't actually give anything as much as he says, well, we've done this in a way that anyone can speculate about what they think it means. And I think that's important, and obviously plenty of people have. But I think so much importance has been placed on this question and answer, and I think a lot of it stems from a lack of understanding of the complete context of what he's trying to convey. And this happens all the time with Zelda translations. The Link to the Past manual is got the famous poem in it, yada yada, where the sky is gold, not blue. And that's completely mistranslated. It's because it's missing context from the previous sentence that actually says that the sacred realm is beneath the heavens, not in the sky. And I think that a lot of evidence and arguments have been hung on this particular question. And I don't mean to kind of like beat it to death, but this is a really good case of people who actually translated this correctly years ago were getting harassed immeasurably in their comments in other places, telling people that they were intentionally misleading the fandom and other things, and they actually weren't. They had it right. And these were translators that have been in the Zelda community for a really long time. And rather than actually listen to these people that we had trusted all along, for some people, they didn't confirm their biases and what they wanted the story to be, and they chose to externalize their emotions rather than deal with the fact that they were wrong. And I think that's really important. It's a good point of reflection for people, especially if you're one of the people who happens to be listening to this. Now that we compare this information with other interviews and things that happened in Age of Imprisonment, I think what he might have been referring to as a hypothetical in there, if anything at all, is actually much more clear. After Age of Imprisonment came out, there's an interview with Famitsu, and the interviewer asks, without going into story or spoilers, fragments of the scenario depicted here were scattered throughout Tears of the Kingdom. At the time that Tears of the Kingdom was being developed, was the full scope of the imprisoning war already decided? And Fujibayashi jumps in and says, yes, everything, including the parts not explicitly shown in the game, was fundamentally decided as background lore. That's essential in creating a story. We had already thought through what kind of event the imprisoning war and what happened during it. However, we didn't put all of that into Tears of the Kingdom itself. Earlier, Hayashi-san mentioned feeling that Tears of the Kingdom was a message telling them that they should make this game, Hyrule Warriors. When we were making Tears of the Kingdom, there's no discussion about it yet, about developing Age of Imprisonment, but personally I hope that there might be someday another opportunity. So when we actually received the proposal, my reaction was, so it's finally come, and I shared all the imprisoning war-related settings and story elements I'd been holding on to. Of course, Age of Imprisonment also includes newly created elements and original content developed specifically for this title. So we considered that they had been telling us out from the beginning, take this at face value. Whether you believe this or not, I personally don't care. I'm taking it at face value. What we can derive from this is that the conversation that Robert and Minoru have in Age of Imprisonment about the destruction of the Zonai and how they have to piece together what remains of their own history from various notes and limited records and more or less oral knowledge and history passed down. This is probably what Fujibayashi may have been referring to, if he was even referring to anything at all. It is the thing that actually meets the criteria of what he was even talking about in those sentences about a destroyed history of something before that wasn't a kingdom. And I think that's really interesting. Anyhow, if you made this far, I'm super glad to have you going through this. I knew that this has been kind of an interesting and controversial topic, and as that was really important to revisit it, especially after working with a native speaker firm in Japan to actually translate the question and answer that so many people have thought over. And I'm glad to share it, because I think it's important to actually set the record straight. No doubt, this is not going to change some people's minds, and that's okay. I think, aligning with the intent of the creators of the series, they say that they've given an internally consistent framework for people to speculate about. And again, speculating about whatever you want is really important. But I think, and I hope, that by trying to set the record straight about this interview, getting it translated from a native speaker firm, and it's legally certified, is important. I think it gives a chance to kind of refute the idea that people are just out there intentionally mistranslating interviews and things like that in order to affirm some sort of bias that they have. No doubt those things do happen sometimes, but in this case, it doesn't seem to be the case. As with a lot of my videos, the resources and the things I mentioned in here, namely the raw speaker notes and text that I got back from TMJ Japan, will be shared in the description, along with resources for the Famitsu interview and anything else that I mentioned. If you enjoyed this, I hope you leave me a comment and tell me what parts you liked. If you'd like me to do more things like this, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, my friends.